Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Campus Consortium's EdTalks webinar series. Today's topic for the EdTalk is CARES Financial Relief Act explained by EDUCAUSE and NASFAA. Our presenters for today's session are Jarret Cummings, Senior Advisor for Policy and Government Relations at EDUCAUSE, Megan Coval, Vice President for Policy and Federal Relations at National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrator, and Director, and also Dr. Carl Horvath, Chief Information Officer at LaSalle University. We will take questions at the end of today's presentation. Please enter the questions into the chat box or questions pane in your Zoom control panel. Now, without further ado, please allow me to present Jarret Cummings, Megan Coval, and Carl Horvath. Over to you, Carl.
Thank you very much, Rosie. Much appreciated, and welcome to everybody. I'm looking at the registration. We have over 400 attendees for today's EdTalk about CARES financial relief. And that goes to show you the intense interest in this topic right now of what we're all going through. I got a look at some of the people who signed up, just seeing a lot of people I know out there. Ken Iyer from City College, New York. Hi, Ken. And several other people from all over the country. Also see somebody from Gwinnett Mercy University, Josephina, signed up. And Jennifer Hausman from LaSalle. Hi, Jen. Also have Kimberly Clark from Bryn Athyn and Bryn Athyn University. Charles Elliott from Lemoyne College, Lemoyne Owen College. Hi, Charles. And Susan Bowen from University of Scranton. Hi, Susan. Also Tony, who I talked to the other day from Calumet College of St. Joseph. So welcome to everyone who signed up. We got quite a mix of attendees today between technology people, financial aid people, finance people, and advancement development people. So it's going to be a great conversation. Hopefully there's something for everybody today. And I'm going to tell you just a little bit about Campus Consortium, who's hosting these Ed Talks. I came to know Campus Consortium some years ago as a collaborative community that shared ideas and resources. And Campus Consortium is a leading nonprofit educational association with thousands of higher education and K-12 school district members. Established 17 years ago in 2003 by current chairman Anjali Jain, who worked with 14 founding higher ed institutions, including Case Western Reserve University, Rochester Institute of Technology, and University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Campus Consortium established an executive advisory committee of higher ed leaders and CIOs to guide its mission, and this structure is in still place today. What I like about the consortium is that it's guided and influenced by a community of my peers. Campus Consortium reacts to the needs of the education community and assists where it needs to help the most. Membership includes both large and small institutions that are involved and want to help each other. I've been able to implement projects at my institutions that would never have been possible without this association. I've also benefited from the collaboration and relationships of its members. There's no need to reinvent the wheel when you can leverage a community of peers who have addressed similar projects and problems. The Campus Consortium mission is to serve the underserved by providing grants and underwriting to projects that can benefit students and align with institutional strategic plans for all members. So I'm just going to kind of try to move you along here and talk a little bit about some of, here's a couple grants and some schools that have been recently awarded. And this association allows them to implement things like there's single sign-on and a multi-factor authentication grants, things that our school has also been able to implement. These grants on the screen right now, you should be able to see some of the grants that are out there that are very relevant to the COVID, the pandemic situation that we're all experiencing. And, these are, again, to help institutions that normally couldn't afford to do this on their own or with your standard vendor association. The fact is that we've all been faced to be online schools almost immediately and had to turn around and become an online institution within a matter of weeks. And because of this change, we now have to focus on how we're servicing our students, student success, student retention. All these things are still relevant in the online world. And so we also have to address our infrastructure and how we interact with our end users. Special thanks to some of our sponsors that actually the consortium is associated with, and that's how the grants and work in in-kind collaboration with our sponsors. And actually today, out listed in the attendee list, we use sponsors, or actually could be sponsors. We have Oracle, Salesforce, and I see SoftDocs out there. Who are vendors that work with Campus Consortium. Oracle is an existing sponsor. So now that you know a little bit about Campus Consortium, today is the EdTalk. So one of the great things as a member institution of Campus Consortium is that we get to bring up relevant topics and questions. Not too long ago, there was a question about COVID response, immediate COVID response. Cisco came and talked a little bit about giving advice to institutions on an EdTalk, how to immediately respond. And this was very helpful. We had over 500 people sign up to learn more about that. Now that the CARES financial allocations are being distributed, EDUCAUSE and NASFAA have come to talk to you today about how those funds are determined and distributed, and we want to know how can they be utilized. That's a big question on many people's minds. So today I have the pleasure of introducing two speakers. We have Megan Coval, Vice President for Policy and Federal Relations at NASFAA. Megan is the Vice President at NASFAA, where she oversees the association's policy and advocacy efforts. Prior to joining NASFAA in the fall of 2010, she served as the Director of Government Relations for the Federal Advisory Committee on Student Financial Assistance, where she contributed to several congressionally mandated reports on the post-secondary access and persistence of low and moderate income students. Megan began her career in higher education as an admissions counselor at Penn State University. She received a master's in higher education at Penn State, a BA in political science. Our other guest speaker is Jarret Cummings. Jarret serves EDUCAUSE as Senior Advisor for Policy and Government Relations, and in this capacity, he oversees the association's effort to address federal policy issues with significant implications for higher education, IT, particularly in the areas of information security and data privacy, e-learning, IT accessibility, and networking and telecommunications. Prior to his current position, Cummings served EDUCAUSE as a policy specialist in its Washington office, special assistant to the president, and program administrator for the EDUCAUSE Learning Initiative, ELI, the association's primary teaching and learning with technology program. So welcome to both our guests today, and thank you for being here. What we're going to do is kind of move along and talk to you a little bit about each of these topics that we're faced with. And we're going to begin. I just want to let you know that there will be some poll questions throughout today's presentation. Please participate. It really gives us a handle, and it also helps EDUCAUSE and NASFAA understand what you're going through right now as an institution. So we will be reading the results of the polls as we go through the presentation. Also, questions are more than welcome. Please add them to the chat section of Zoom. We'd appreciate those questions, and we will read those toward the end of the presentation. So today's agenda is getting to CARES and beyond. And so I'm going to hand it off to Jarret Cummings.
Great, thanks, Carl. And I was just thinking as you were going through our bios that I had once again forgotten to send my educational background to you as I promised. So just in case anybody really wants to know, I have my master's in public administration from Syracuse and my bachelor's in philosophy from Southwestern University in beautiful sunny Georgetown, Texas, just north of Austin. So down to our agenda, we're going to start with setting the context for the federal emergency spending that we've seen thus far, leading up to and just a little past where we are with the CARES Act, so we can get a sense for additional possibilities to come. And then Megan's going to lead into some of the specifics around the emergency student grants. And I'm going to come back in just at the end and talk a little bit about the institutional portion of the CARES Act funding. Next slide. Thank you. So in terms of how we got to where we are today, there really was just an unprecedented volume of supplemental appropriations in the month of March in response to the pandemic, as the overall scope of what we were facing as a nation started to come into view. So it really began with the $8 billion bill that was passed right at the beginning of March, which was actually about a little over 3 times what the administration had actually requested at that point to fund the emergency public health response. So to ramp up research and development of vaccines and testing, to get more money out to state and local health agencies and so forth. Congress looked at the initial $2.5 billion request from the administration, decided that the numbers were building in a way that just wasn't adequate, and pushed out quite a considerable, what under normal circumstances would be a very sizable funding package in and of itself. But then in short order, as the case numbers started to build, as the national accumulation of deaths related to the pandemic started to build, we saw Congress come back with another $192 billion in spending, this time to really ensure that, primarily to ensure that employees, particularly employees at mid-sized to smaller firms, could get paid sick leave and paid family and medical leave if it was related to the pandemic response, as well as to facilitate free access for Medicare and Medicaid patients, as well as children taking advantage of the CHIP program for COVID testing and treatment, things of that nature. And again, as the numbers accumulated, as the impact started to build, we saw truly an unprecedented response with the CARES Act, where Congress and the administration ultimately agreed to about $2.2 trillion in federal emergency appropriations, a large portion of which was for direct payments to individuals and families to help them deal with the economic impacts of the pandemic, as well as to expand unemployment, both in terms of the people covered, the range of positions within the economy covered, and ultimately the amount of unemployment money that individuals will receive. And then, of course, there was also the Paycheck Protection Program, which many institutions have come to know and love, or to curse, depending on the day and whether you're appropriate or whether your loans come through yet or not. So that's, the overall scope of the CARES Act is just simply breathtaking. There's never been anything like it in the federal government previously. And of course, for higher education and K through 12, the focus really zeroes in on the roughly $31 billion that was provided in CARES for the education sector. Next slide. So in terms of what higher education was seeking in that third supplemental appropriation bill, which became the CARES Act, and what we received, there's quite a disparity, but at the end of the day, we actually came through better than we otherwise thought we might. So as that bill was coming together, the higher education community came together to support a request for about $50 billion in aid directly to higher education, with the major planks really being around direct funding to students and institutions, a zero interest loan program to help institutions either address current needs or to refinance past debt to free up institutional revenue to support the pandemic response. And then also what was near and dear to my heart, an almost $8 billion technology implementation fund to help institutions deal with the rapid transition from classroom-based instruction to emergency remote learning, and ultimately to true online learning as time and resources permitted. As you guessed from the previous slide, we did not get our $50 billion that we very much believe we needed. We ended up with about $14 billion in aid for higher education, which still, under the circumstances, was a win. At the start of that CARES Act negotiating process, the Senate was not very interested in providing aid to the education sector, much less aid to higher education as part of the education sector at all. So the fact that we ultimately did as well as we did in that process is a real testament to the outreach that all of the associations did to their membership and the membership's overwhelming response in communicating to their senators and congressmen and congresspeople, that there was a real driving need for emergency support for higher education. So within that 14 billion, about 12.6 billion was allocated for direct aid to students and institutions on a 50-50 basis, with $1 billion set aside for the unique problems and needs of minority serving institutions, and then $350 million set aside for grants to hard-hit, largely smaller institutions that otherwise might not have their needs effectively met. That grant process, some of you may remember the Fund for the Improvement of Post-Secondary Education, or FIPSE. It was a largely dormant or very limited grant program that the bill revived for this purpose, but it also then means that institutions have to go through a grant application process to access that funding. Next slide, please. So before we start talking about that $14 billion, I did want to talk about the post-CARES process and a little bit about where we stand today. So the fourth spending bill, which was approved in April, technically is considered the 3.5 bill because it was really focused on replenishing the payroll protection program, where the demand for the roughly $350 billion that was originally appropriated for the program outstripped that funding capacity in a very short order. So Congress appropriated another $321 billion to extend more more Paycheck Protection Program loans to employers. And then on top of that, Congress added $100 billion again to enhance the country's pandemic response to support hospitals and healthcare providers in being able to continue to provide care, as well as to, again, try to jumpstart COVID-19 testing and help improve our, testing and tracing response. Since then, we've been waiting for the what is deemed the fourth bill, which the House has taken a first stab at with its HEROES Act, what had previously been called CARES 2 up to the actual introduction of the bill. That bill is, again, another unprecedented proposal from Congress to address the emergency funding needs of the country. Of roughly roughly $3 trillion in scope, with about $850 billion set aside for emergency funding for state and local governments, which have been particularly hard hit in both in terms of revenue and expenditures due to the pandemic. It would also issue another round of direct payments to a large swath of the public, this time with a cap of up to $6,000 per family. So another very significant effort to help individuals and families deal with their sudden contraction in the economy. In terms of higher education, we've come back and again requested close to $50 billion in direct student and institutional aid, using largely the same formula that was set up under the CARES Act, where about 3/4 of the funding would be allocated to institutions based upon their Pell Grant enrollment, with another 25% based on their FTE enrollment. The idea here is really that rather than having a multi-part proposal as we did with CARES, that at this juncture, the simplest path is the easiest path toward hopefully getting the support that we need, and providing institutions with discretionary funds to deal with their needs is probably a better path than looking for specific allocations in specific areas. Now, in HEROES, the House has set its allocation for higher education in that bill at $37 billion, with about $27 billion to be directed to public institutions via allocations to the states, and another $7 billion to be directed to private nonprofit colleges and universities through the Department of Education, and then other miscellaneous elements making up the rest. So we know at this juncture, even with the HEROES Act and getting a very sympathetic hearing in the House, we're short of where we would like to be in terms of federal support. And the hope is that as the negotiations between the House and Senate move forward, that we will be able to impress upon them the need for the full extent of the aid that the higher education community is requesting. And with that, I think we have our first poll question. So if you could let us know if your institution has already distributed its CARES Act funding, its emergency grants to students. And we're starting off light, so just a straight yes or no.
Justin, quick question just about that HEROES bill. I know that there is a shortfall there, but what do you think the chances are of getting closer to the number requested?
My sense is that it's probably not great, but things are still fairly unpredictable. With the economic consequences and the fiscal consequences of the pandemic continuing to mount, there's always the possibility that we will be able to continue making the case and expanding Congress's interest in providing support to higher education. Probably the key to HEROES, and hopefully what will come from whatever the final bill is to alleviate the budgetary shortfalls for state and local governments, because that will probably go the farthest towards sustaining support for public institutions, right, and thus mitigating some of the severe budget impacts that institutions would otherwise face.
Thank you. Yes, and looks like we have our poll results from our poll question. Has your institution already distributed CARES funds to students? And it looks like 69% have said yes, and 31% said no. So it looks like 2/3 of our audience has already received and distributed the funds.
Great.
All right, thank you, Jarret. I think I want to hand it over to Megan now, and Megan, take it away.
All right, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here with you on behalf of NASFAA, and I really appreciate the polling that we're going to be doing, because I can tell you just anecdotally that we at NASFAA get the question a whole lot these days about how many schools have pushed out the funds, and I was just on a couple media calls on Friday where they wanted to know that, and I thought that most schools had done it, or at least are very much into the process of doing so. So I appreciate that confirmed what we're thinking. So Jarret did a great job of introducing the CARES Act and what was in there for higher education. And so I just want to, at a high level, touch on some key points here about the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund. Again, there were $14 billion in this particular fund. $1 billion of it set aside for minority serving institutions, another smaller chunk set aside for institutions with high levels of unmet need. And then the really kind of big piece that we've been working on a lot is that roughly $12.5 billion that goes to institutions, where it's split in half, and at least 50% of it does have to be spent on your students. That is the piece that we have been knee deep in over the past couple of months, and my guess is some of you all have as well, and also the institutional piece, but the student piece one, unpacking that and figuring out how to help schools implement that has really been what we're working on. One thing I just wanted to note and put a little bit finer point on is that the allocation formula is weighted heavily towards student need. And Jarret already mentioned this, that it takes into account 75% of your full-time Pell enrollment and then 25% of your full-time enrollment. And the thing I just wanted to reiterate there was that was clearly Congress saying we want to get this money to institutions and therefore to students at schools that have kind of the highest amount of need, and really taking into account their Pell population. So that was a really important piece of congressional intent there. So before I go to my next slide, I think we have another poll here. And again, thank you, because I hope we're being helpful to you today, but I'm realizing that these poll questions are going to help us do our work as well. So has your college or university applied for its institutional aid, which it couldn't do until it had applied for the student aid portion of the HERF funds? Yes, no, don't know.
Again, you must be fielding a lot of these questions that you're talking about. Are more of the questions about how to allocate the student aid or the institutional aid, or is it a mix of both?
It's really a mix of both, but I will say it's been more heavily focused on the student piece, and that is because, and we'll talk about this a little bit at the end too, but no reason we can't now. There's just been multiple iterations of guidance that have come down from the department, and in several cases, conflicting guidance and guidance that has changed. So it's an instance where we think we have it figured out, and then we get something else that has us kind of have to go back and reassess.
Thank you. So it looks like our poll results are back. Has your college or university applied for its institutional aid, which it couldn't do until it had applied for its share of the student aid? Looks like 68% of our audience has applied, and 8% said no, and then 24% don't know. So this is a great place to, kind of ask that question, because we have our experts here. Any insight on this particular question, Megan?
I think these numbers make sense to me. The one key thing is that you weren't able to apply for the institutional aid until you had applied for that student piece, so you couldn't get the institutional piece first. So I think this really kind of lines up with the answers to the first slide there. Mm-hmm. And then I think we have another poll question here. So sort of related, has your college or university received its institutional aid?
Yes, and so one thing is applying for it. Next thing is, what do you do with it? In all the, I guess, the questions that you field about what to do with those funds, what are the biggest misnomer about the funds, or mistakes that people often make about it, or how rumors get around and like, oh, I think I can spend it for this or that. Do you get a common theme there, or is that all over the place too?
Yeah, I mean, there are many questions. I would say that the institutional aid in general is what I would call more flexible than the student piece. And so most of the questions come on the student piece. The institution might ask, can I reimburse myself for money that I already spent on students? And the answer is no for the student piece. But in some cases, what we say no to on the student piece, you can say yes to on the institutional side. And Jarret and I are going to unpack that a little bit later too. So that's kind of the theme of the questions, I would say.
Great. Looks like our poll results are back, and has your college or university received its institutional aid? And looks like 43% said yes, 23 said no, and 33% said don't know.
Mhm.
Again, kind of all over the place with this, as we're in flux with this whole situation.
Yeah.
Here's the last poll question, I think.
Yep. So how much institutional aid does your college or university plan to allocate to technology enablement? So pandemic-related technology expenses.
Yeah, and that's, I guess this is pertinent in the case of what Jarret mentioned in the beginning of the talk today, was a little bit about, trying to reinvent yourself from maybe a traditionally on-campus or on-ground institution into a completely online, and not just online for servicing students, teaching and learning, but also work from home for all the staff and faculty. I mean, people are not allowed on campus. I know that in PA there's a stay-at-home order in place at least until June, and so that will definitely put all the focus to kind of interacting with our students, faculty, and staff online. So it looks like our poll results are back, and how much institutional aid does your college or university plan to allocate to technology enablement? And some 4% said no, some said 43%, most said 15%, and all said 1%. So looks like, and then 39% needs to plan. So there's again, kind of distributed use of those funds. I'm sure there's so many things to do. So interesting.
Yeah, this is again really helpful information to us, and you can go ahead to the next slide. I'm going to be talking primarily about the student piece, and then Jarret's going to jump back in at the end with the institutional piece. But one thing I wouldn't be surprised, and you all can ask questions about this or flag this in the discussion, is I think that there has been so much confusion and back and forth over the student piece that my guess would be as many institutions are just thinking, okay, I need to figure out, what I'm doing with these students and getting it out the door and doing it in the correct way. And then maybe might move then to the institutional side after that, and focusing their energies on that to the extent that the same people are working on both funds. So just a few more what I'll call fast facts, again, about the student piece. This was made more complicated by information we got from the Department of Education at the end of last week. But the biggie here is these dollars are not Title IV dollars. And so what that really means, big picture, is that institutions are sort of freed, I'm going to give a big caveat here in a minute, but from a lot of the rules and regulations that come along with, and reporting requirements that come along with the Title IV dollars. Initially, the guidance came out on April 9th, and there were no eligibility restrictions. So the certification agreement for the student funds came out that institutions signed. The original letter from the secretary said nothing about certain students not being able to get these funds. And then there was follow-up guidance on April 21st that said students must actually be Title IV eligible or could be Title IV eligible in order to get these funds. So that threw a little bit of a monkey wrench into some of the plans that institutions were already making. So for example, if you were a school that maybe said, you know what, I believe that all of my students had an expense related to COVID-19, I was going to give everyone a little piece of the pie. You could no longer do that because not all of your students likely are Title IV eligible. So then institutions had to figure out, what does that mean? Should I only give it to my current Title IV students? If somebody else wants it that is not Title IV eligible, should I make them fill out a FAFSA? So we were working through, and still were early last week, trying to figure out how to advise institutions there. And then Thursday evening, there was an update to ED's guidance, and I use the word update because they did not change their guidance, where they came out and said that they would not be enforcing the Title IV eligibility piece that they had put into place. So a little bit of word salad, as we called it. It took our team about an hour to walk through it on a 8:30 p.m. Zoom call on Thursday night. But essentially what's happening is the guidance is in place. They are saying students should be Title IV eligible, but they are just saying we are not going to enforce that particular provision. What do you do with that? That's a very important question, and one that we feel like we can't make for institutions. I think there's been a lot of scenarios throughout this whole process where you just have had to make calls on the risk that you're willing to assume. So I think, taking it back and talking through, are we willing to do this and just trust the department says they won't enforce it? Those are decisions that we can't make, but we can just tell you what the department is saying. The very important piece there is that DACA and undocumented students are still excluded. Among friends here, I will say that it is the general feeling, or at least NASFAA's feeling, that this is what the department was trying to do all along, was just ensure that the undocumented or DACA students didn't get it. And the way that they did that is they went bigger picture and just said, well, you have to be Title IV eligible then in order to get the funds, knowing that DACA undocumented students are not and cannot be Title IV eligible. So we're back to a place where we've freed up the funds for some students, the students who are not getting Title IV dollars or may not be eligible, but not that particular population of students. So it's left in a very kind of messy spot, and we're also fully aware, as many of you answered in the beginning, that you have already pushed out these funds. So it might be a little bit too late for some of these students anyhow. But we can talk more about that if you have questions. And then quickly, I'll just sort of breeze through some of the other fast facts. Just an important one here that raised a lot of questions is that the focus here on the students' funds is really about expense versus need. And that's kind of a funny thing to wrap your head around when you're talking about student aid, because we're normally always talking about need and what's the student's need or unmet need. But the statute was very specific that the HERF student share dollars were to go to students who had expenses related to the disruption of campus operations due to COVID-19. So that is different than a student who has a need, right? So if a student comes and says, but my parent lost their job or I lost my job, that's obviously a tough situation for that student, but it's not an expense that they incurred. So an expense that they incurred would be something like they had to suddenly move out of their dorm, and then they had to buy a plane ticket home because they lived across the country, or they needed a laptop or needed to purchase some additional software. You all know far more about technology than I do, but anything that would kind of fall into that camp. So that's a really important distinction, especially for schools who would say something like, what I would like to just give these dollars to all my Pell students. You can't do that. What you can do is identify a population of students or have an application for students to identify that they had an expense. And from there, you can say, okay, of those students, I will prioritize my Pell students. But you couldn't just say across the board, I'm going to give to this one population without knowing their expense. And then if you want to hit the next slide, I'll go over my last little fast fact here. This is just another important piece, and I think this part has been hammered home by now, but this money was meant to be direct into the hands of students in the form of cash grants. And so what came up pretty frequently, and I understand why the question was asked, is that a lot of institutions said, well, you know what, I already, before the CARES Act passed, refunded room and board, or I bought a whole subset of students laptop. Can I use that money to reimburse myself? And the answer is no, and the department was very clear about this, is that they wanted that money to go to students and get there as quickly as possible, directly to them. The other question that was asked there, since we talked about frequently asked questions, is some schools said, well, you know what, I have identified this student that has an expense, and it just so happens they have a balance, a tuition balance. Can I just take that money and pay off their balance? And the answer is no. We did ask that question at NASFAA, and we said, what if we gave the student the choice? If we said to the student, we'll cut you this check, or we'll apply it right to your balance? And the answer is no. Has to go right to the student. If they want to turn around and pay the bill with it, they can, but it has to go right into their hands. So that was the really big piece there. You can go ahead to the next slide. And then a lot of this we've kind of talked through already. Talked very specifically about how the student fund needs to be related to expenses due to campus disruption, the institutional related to expenses incurred due to change in instructional delivery. And then there's just reporting that is required for both of them, although we're still waiting for some follow-up information on that. So that is, something many institutions are asking about because the reporting deadlines are coming up, but I think that's really important. And the other thing I'll just note about this slide is that I think we're hoping in the next bill, and Jarret talked about it a little bit, that there's a little bit more broad eligibility. So it's pretty specific that you have to identify an expense for due to campus disruption. I think we would love to see that brought into maybe an expense or a need that has arisen in a student's financial circumstance. So those are going to be things that we're pushing as well. And then I think I have one more slide here. Excuse me. And then again, we've already sort of talked about this in some of the chatter that we've had already, but I'll just say that if you feel like it's confusing, you're right, and it is. And we are actually even expecting some more guidance from the department this week for providing further clarification. So we talked about this room and board example. We talked about the example of an institution purchasing laptops and using the student funds to reimburse themselves. Jarret will talk a little bit more about what you can do with the institutional dollars. I think we walked through all of these examples already. But the one thing I'll say is that, from NASFAA's perspective, again, we try our best to give you the most up-to-date information, but there really is, unfortunately, a lot that the school has to do with this scenario that in terms of just gauging risk and what you're comfortable with and what you're comfortable going out with. The guidance continues to change, but many schools have the dollars out the door. And I think that was a message also given to them from Capitol Hill to get the money out. So you had to weigh doing that versus getting all the information. So I'll stop there and let Jarret continue with the more muddy waters.
Yeah, the murk continues. But where a lot of those frequently asked questions that Megan had on her last slide were no for the student portion of the aid. As she mentioned previously, it's yes when it comes to the institutional portion of the aid. So we provide the link here so you can go straight to the department's guidance around the institutional share of the aid. And as it notes, the clock for the expenses that you can use the funding for starts on March 13th with the National Emergency Declaration. So that's an important point. Expenses incurred prior to that point are not coverable by CARES Act funding. You really do have to read all of the documents that are provided there because as I show below in the rest of the slide, you have to extract bits and pieces from the various documents to get a picture of what the funding can be used for from an institutional standpoint. And really started with, in some ways, the last source of information first in terms of talking about the FAQ, where the FAQ makes the blanket statement that any costs associated with significant changes to the delivery of instruction due to the coronavirus count for the institutional share, excluding payments for pre-enrollment, recruiting and marketing, capital expenditures related to athletic facilities or religious facilities, and some other items such as that. But essentially, you're really focused on the expenses that derive from the impact of the pandemic on the institution and how instruction had to change to accommodate it. And so that takes us into the agreement that institutions have to sign in order to access that institutional allocation, where the point is made that institutions have discretion in terms of how they apply those funds, but that discretion needs to be backed by a reasoned basis for concluding such costs have a clear nexus to significant changes to the delivery of instruction. So as Megan was mentioning earlier, there's a lot of sentence diagramming that goes along with interpreting these documents. But the bottom line is you need to make sure that the expenses that you want to use the institutional aid for directly relate to the change in instruction at the institution, and that you can provide that reasoned basis, which generally means documentation as to what the allocation, what the allocation was made for and how it relates to the change in instruction due to the pandemic response. And so that's where the institution can, for example, reimburse itself for technology that it purchased or donated to students as part of the pandemic response, or internet service. Some institutions have bought Wi-Fi hotspots and mailed those out to students to allow them to stay online. That would also be considered an allowable expense. Increases in your seat licensing fees for adding seats to your learning management system, your online program management system, or systems that they provide, things of that nature, would also be allowable technology costs. And then at the same time, you have to think about this in balance, because this is where that distinction between the $8 billion technology implementation fund we were hoping for and the more discretionary set of funding that we ultimately received come into play. Those technology expenditures also are in the same mix with, and you see this within the HERF agreement, where they note that institutions can also use their institutional aid to reimburse themselves for the room and board refunds they made, for the tuition refunds that they may have given to students, and for fee refunds that they may have made to made to students. So you get into this mix where you can use funding, and as the secretary encouraged in her letter, the idea that institutions would use their institutional aid to help support their remote learning activities, build their IT capacity to support those programs, and to train up faculty and staff to advance those programs. That's certainly an emphasis that the department has stressed, but at the same time, there's one pot of money and there are a lot of potential expenses that the institution's probably seeking to cover from it. So that's again where documenting the need and addressing those in the context of the institution's discretion, how the institution is making decisions about the allocation of that funding, really becomes important. And so with that, I think we're off to the Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Jarret and Megan. Helpful. Yep. And, some of the things that you just mentioned are addressed here. And we do have some Q&A we definitely want to get to quickly. We have several questions that have come in. We just put a few out there if we can kind of run through these. So Tracy Beatty from Kellogg Community College, who's the finance director there, said, for schools that elected to auto-distribute the CARES Act funds without requiring an application, is there an expectation to reverse CARES awards if errors are found similar to Title IV programs?
I think I can answer that quickly. I think it would depend on when you initially had the application, if you required that they were Title IV eligible. That piece I don't know. In terms of them not enforcing that anymore, I think that's a question that your institution will have to answer at your level of comfort if you decide to change or not.
Thank you. Elizabeth Zimmerman from Salisbury University, the budget officer. Questions about CARES institutional funding. The FAQs indicate institutions are able to reimburse themselves for refunds processed to students after 3/13/20, i.e. lost revenue. In FY20, if an institution anticipates having revenue shortfalls in FY21 due to the densification of residence halls, can CARES funding be drawn down in FY21 as a replacement for lost FY21 revenue?
I think that really comes down to that reasoned basis for the change in instruction. If you think you can establish that as the basis for that expense, then that's something to consider. But I think that might be seen as a bit tenuous.
Okay. We have a question from Charles Elliott, Vice President of Information Technology at Lemoyne College. Will the $1 billion for HBCUs have the same rules as the previous restrictions? Half going to students, et cetera.
take this, Jarret, if that's all right.
Yeah, I think I thought there was a different structure for the $1 billion in minority serving institution funds, but I don't recall the specifics.
Yeah, I was just looking, I saw that question and was just poking around in the certification agreement. It does say that 50% of it does need to be spent on students, but I think there are different, it doesn't carry over all of the other eligibility criteria. So you'd want to look into that in terms of what can be spent on, things like that.
Great. Nathan Phillips from American College of Healthcare Sciences. Small schools would seem to be at a huge disadvantage, lacking the internal resources that are available to large schools to merely manage the application process for aid/grants. Is this true? Are small institutions getting aid in proportion to large institutions? Any further thoughts about that issue?
I don't think we have a window on that. I'll defer to Megan, but I think my sense is we're probably not going to be able to really make that assessment for a while yet.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, I think the allocation formula for these grants was the same for every institution, and I heard you mention application. You didn't have to have an application process. The school could have decided to how to give the funds away. So I think that varies from institution to institution. But yeah, I think big picture, it's a little too soon to tell, probably.
All right, Gabriella Leon from Alvin Community College Financial Aid Director asks, can we retroactively give funds to students who could have been eligible for CARES funds in spring, but didn't have a FAFSA at the time funds were awarded?
If you feel comfortable with the department's new update that they are not going to enforce the Title IV eligibility piece, then and that's what the department has said as of Thursday, that they aren't going to sort of go after that piece. But I think that would be up to your level of comfort.
We have a question from Michelle Barron. Would the institutional portion be able to use to reimburse for supplies we bought to reopen with safety precautions? For example, supplies, thermometer, masks, and face shields.
That would seem to have a clear nexus to the change in instruction that's taken place institutionally, but I think, again, it's really about building a case internally that you as an institution are comfortable making to the department that the expenses that you incurred directly relate to that change in instruction due to the pandemic. That's the difficulty. The plus side of institutional discretion is that you have flexibility. The downside of institutional discretion is that they're not providing, at least at this time, a tremendous amount of structure around institutional use of the funds. It's more about making a decision that you feel ties directly to that change in instruction and being able to document it.
Great. Okay, we have a question from Johan Zimmerman. You mentioned that student Wi-Fi access points are eligible for reimbursements. Would that also apply to running monthly internet access fees via ISP or telco provider, internet service provider or telecommunications provider?
Yes, if in the HERF institutional agreement, the institutional share agreement, it mentions expense for the service itself.
Great. All right. I guess we are kind of running right up against our hour. I want to thank you, Megan and Jarret, very much for joining us today. It was a great, insightful presentation with the latest information, which was really helpful. I think it was for me, as we're becoming and staying an online institution now for a while, in terms of that will probably never go away for any institution. We'll always have to be ready for this. So as being part of the consortium, I know they're thinking about grants, particularly with COVID response and us staying in this situation for an extended period. So there will be assistance and help We're also going to host a follow-up EdTalk on how one of our member CFOs is using the technology funds towards some of our grants to implement cybersecurity and other services. So, you know, Campus Consortium has information on that event, which we can get out to. There's a lot of questions, and we will be sharing the Q&As because we didn't get to all the questions. I mean, there was an immense amount of questions in the chat. So we're going to share the Q&A along with the call and the recordings of today Ed Talks on the Campus Consortium website. So again, Megan, Jarret, thanks so much. Much appreciated for your assistance and help. Coming up, we have next Ed Talk will be with Columbia University, Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, and University of Illinois to Chicago. It's about artificial intelligence strategy. Another thing that will help with online presence and student success issues that we're all facing. So thanks for everybody that attended today. Much appreciated. Any questions, feel free to reach out to Campus Consortium. And Megan and Jarret, thanks so much for your insight and assistance on this CARES topic today. Much appreciated.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.